We have completed implementation of catalog service, order service and notification service without security, and we are going to implement API gateway by using Spring Cloud Gateway in this video. So the clients are going to talk to API gateway, which delegates the calls to one of the microservice based on some pattern. So let's get started. First, let us understand why do we need API gateway in the first place. So for example, let us take an example of we have a bunch of microservices and then there is an API gateway and there can be one or more clients and they are going to talk to only API gateway, not directly to microservices. Why is that? Why can't client 1 can directly talk to microservice 1, 2, 3, 4? What is the purpose of having API gateway? So let us try to understand that. Let's say we are an organization and we are trying to build a product and we are using microservices architecture. And whether we want to build this whole product using microservices architecture or monolithic architecture, it's all a technical concern. And from the client perspective, it should always be a single product. They should not be worried about whether it is using microservices architecture or a monolithic architecture, what kind of programming languages the company is using. That shouldn't be the client's concern. So one way to hide all these technical architecture details is by using API gateway. So with the API gateway, for the client perspective, it is always like they are talking to one system. They are not even going to be aware of how many microservices are there behind the scenes. They are always talking to one API. So we are hiding all these complexities from the clients. And second, let's imagine if there is no API gateway and then client is directly using different URLs talking to different services. Okay. So now let's say initially you build one microservice with too many responsibilities, and later you start feeling that it is doing too much and we should ideally split this into multiple microservices. Then if you divide that, it is going to affect all the clients that are using this one. Now when you divide this microservice into two, all the clients who are using some of these API endpoints need to refactor that. But with API gateway in place, you can still split this one microservice into multiple and you can provide that configuration at the API gateway level. Still clients can continue to use those API endpoints with the same URL, but you can configure at the API gateway level to forward that specific URLs to one microservice and then separated URLs to a different microservice. And your client even need not be aware of what is happening behind the scenes. They are completely unaware of any refactoring you can do with the backend architecture. So that is another advantage using API gateway. And third one is dynamic routing to different API versions. Let's say you are building a product and then all the clients may not be on to latest version. Sometimes some clients adopt to newer versions a little late. So maybe in that case you need to run same microservice version 1 and version 2, and depending on the client you may want to forward the request to either version 1 instance or version 2 instance. So you can put all that logic at the API gateway level so that you can transparently forward the calls to respective API versions. And also there is usually you want to apply some resiliency patterns like applying security, rate limiting, timeout and all. So we have seen how we can apply that at a one API call for our order service. But another alternative would be you can implement all that rate limiting, timeouts and all these things at the API gateway level. So if you have some common infrastructure setups like okay, all our API should be implemented with so and so SLAs, or we can restrict the APIs for based on certain security standards. So all that logic can be centralized at the API gateway level instead of implementing for each microservice. So that is another advantage you can have with API gateway. So these are all the benefits of having API gateway, and it is very common for big companies exposing multiple API microservices to use API gateway. So in this application, we are going to build, even though it is a very small application, let us follow that pattern, and we are going to implement this API gateway and forward the calls to catalog service or order service. From the bookstore web app point of view, it is just talking to one service. It is not even aware of there are multiple services behind the scenes. We can create our API gateway service from Spring Initializer. Here I have provided the project metadata, and I am selecting reactive gateway and actuator. These are sufficient. Again, for implementing API gateway, we have two options. One is reactive gateway or servlet based gateway implementation also. But this is introduced recently, and I would like to go with reactive gateway itself. And also behind the scenes, it is going to use Webflux infrastructure. Okay, so now I am generating this application, and I'm going to copy the code into our repository. I have copied the code into our repository here, API gateway, and I have added API gateway as a module to this root pom.xml here. And also I have added some of the common POM configurations we are doing for other services, like I have added this Spring Doc Open API dependency. And if you remember, for other modules we have added Web MVC UI. But for this we are using Webflux UI because we are using Spring Cloud Gateway, which behind the scenes uses Spring Webflux. So that is why we are using Webflux UI. And that is the only additional dependency that we are adding here. And we have added usual customizations for Spring Boot Maven plugin using the Docker image name and a different builder, Git commit ID plugin, and spotless Maven plugin. So the usual configuration we have added. And in this service there isn't much code. So if you take a look at it, our main application class doesn't have any other logic. And so usually so far in our applications we are using application.properties file based configuration. But here there will be a lot of nested configuration. We can still do that configuration in the properties file itself, but that configuration looks simpler by using YAML based configuration. Personally, I don't like YAML based configuration, but API gateway configuration looks much simpler when with the YAML based configuration. So I have already created another application.properties.bag file just to show you, if you still prefer to use properties based configuration, you can configure the same YAML based configuration here in the application properties file like this. So I make it as .bag so that Spring won't read it. So if you prefer, you can use that by removing this .bag file and deleting this YAML file. So I am going to explain through application.yaml file. So here these are usual server port. So here it is supposed to be something different, like we can put it as 8080 or we can put it as 8989. Okay. And we have enabled all the actuator endpoints access, and we have given the application name as API gateway, and we are enabling global cars configuration for all the origins, all the methods. We are accepting all the headers like that. So what exactly is this cars configuration? So basically browsers doesn't allow to issue AJAX requests for different domains. So we need to configure which other domains are allowed to access our API endpoints. So here at the API gateway level, we are configuring that for all the API endpoints, we are allowing the request from any domain. Star means any domain. And also we are saying star means any method, HTTP get, post, delete, all the methods. And we are allowing any headers to pass and use. So that way we are enabling cars for all the domains here. And this is the key part of the API gateway. So here, this is where we are going to configure the rules and how we are going to forward to a different service. So here, for our first route, we are giving a ID saying that catalogs-service, and we are going to forward this request based on this matching criteria. We are going to forward this request to catalog service URL. If you configure some environment variables, it is going to take that. Otherwise, we are going to forward catalog service related request to localhost 8081, which is where our actual catalog service is going to run. But based on what criteria it is going to forward to that URL. So this is where first predicates means this is where it is matching the incoming request. If the incoming request starts with /catalog/anything, then it is going to apply this filter, which is rewrite path. This is one of the filter that is provided out of the box with the Spring Cloud Gateway. So what it is going to do? So if the incoming path is like this, that means /catalog/ and some segment, and in that case it is going to take that segment and then forward the request to /segment, which means, let's say you are forwarding, you are making a request to API gateway like /catalog/API/products. So here, this is the segment. Here /catalog is matching with that, and this is considered as the segment, and it is going to forward the request to API/products. But to which service? This is the base URI we are configuring. So that means if somebody is making a call to HTTP and localhost :8989, this is the port of API gateway, and if somebody is making a call to API gateway /catalog/API/products, it is going to forward that request to this API endpoint. So 8081/API/products. This is the segment part, and that is where our request is going to be forwarded on this particular service. Okay, so this is how the configuration works. So in the similar way, we have another service, order service, and again we have configured some environment variable and providing a default value, which is 8082. And again, if the path prefix starts with /orders, we are going to take the second segment and then forward that request to this segment on this particular service. And finally, we also need to get the aggregated API documentation. So for that, we are configuring this OpenAPI JSON request here. So again, if there is a request for v3/API docs, it is going to forward to any of these paths and then trying to forward this. We will understand this when we see our API documentation. It will become very clear then. Okay, so the rest of the configuration is MVC problem details is a new feature for exception handling, that is we are enabling here. And there is this is how we can customize to aggregate all the information. Like here we can configure under URLs. Okay, we are giving a name like catalog, and then we are configuring this to v3/API docs/catalog. So like this we can configure, but this is a static configuration, and by simply using this we will be able to see these as groups in the Swagger documentation, and we can see the respective API endpoints in that. But this is going to be static. There is another way to figure out dynamically. I mean, let's say this is all the configuration to simply read dynamically what are all the services we have defined in our YAML file, and then figure out these paths and creating these URLs dynamically. So first I am going to comment this out whole thing, and then I am going to uncomment this, and based on this configuration first we will see how the Swagger documentation looks like. Then we can we can see how we can make this dynamically by using this configuration. Okay, for now let us comment that out, and I hope this is clear. Now what I'm going to do, I'll see if all the services are already running, and here all the services are running including API gateway. I'm going to remove this. So all the rest of the services like order service and notification service, catalog service, everything is running in Docker. So now I'm going to run this service API gateway only from local. Okay, so let me run it, and I have configured this to be running on 8989. So let me go to so here when I accessed 8989/swagger UI HTML, it redirected to this path, and here you can see it provided a drop down for all the groups. So where did we configure that? Here. So we gave the catalog, and then it went and fetched the API specification document from this path, and for orders it is going to fetch from this path. So that's how when we select catalog, we can see the API endpoints available in the catalog service, and here if you select orders, it is going to fetch order API, and we can see all these paths here. So we can see the aggregated entire our microservices Swagger documentation at API gateway level. We don't have to go to different paths like this. And here if you see the path of this API documentation, this is the Swagger API documentation in the JSON format, and its path is v3/API-docs/orders. So that is the path we have configured here. And this is where it is going to get the JSON specification for catalog. This is where it is going to get the specification from orders. So that is what we have configured, and it is showing up in the Swagger documentation as different groups. Okay, but as I mentioned, the thing is this is going to be static. Right now we know that we have all these services and we have configured like this. But if we don't want to configure like this statically, we can configure using programmatically. Let me explain what happens here. So Swagger config is a Spring configuration class, and then we are injecting route definition locator and Swagger UI configuration properties. So this is coming from Swagger UI library that we have added here. Okay, Swagger Open API starter, and there are various properties that you can customize, and all those properties are already there. And if you go to this super class here, there is a URLs property. So here you can see set of URL properties. This is what we have configured in our application YAML file. But we don't want to configure like this. Instead, we want to provide this configuration dynamically. So here in the post construct, there is a method, and we are adding this at post construct. That means when the application is loaded, it is going to invoke this method. And here what we are doing, we are trying to get all the route definitions here. So they are nothing but this. These are all the route definitions. And what we are doing, once we fetch all the definitions, we have created this URLs hash set. And then while streaming all these route definitions, we are filtering if the ID matches with something. Dot star means any text hyphen service. If our service ID is matching with this pattern, like here we have catalog hyphen service, orders hyphen service, but this is not matching with that pattern. So it is going to read only these two definitions. And what we are doing with those, so first we are filtering to take only the routes which are matching with this pattern of ID, and then for each route definition it is trying to replace this hyphen service with empty. That means it is going to take only catalog orders. Okay, so that is what name is going to be. And then we are going to configure the Swagger URL like this. So here we are giving Swagger some group name here, and this is the default value API URL, which is /v3/API docs and / whatever the name we are fetching, like catalog or orders. Okay, so essentially we are configuring the same values that we are configuring statically here, but this time whenever you add a new service, let us say we are adding another service here with this same pattern, some service name -service, it is going to automatically become part of this Swagger documentation. You don't have to come here and then add one more configuration here. As soon as you add another service, it is, and if it is of the pattern something -service, it is going to automatically show up in this documentation. So if this feels simpler, you can simply follow this, or if you want to have that dynamic configuration, you can use this configuration. API gateway, as I mentioned, can be used for several purposes. Like earlier we mentioned, if you want to specify the timeouts, rate limiting and all, you still can do that. But in our application, we are just using the API gateway as a gateway which delegates a call to downstream services only. We are not implementing any other functionality at API gateway level. It is strictly using it as a dispatcher to downstream services. So this is all the functionality that we have at the API gateway level, and we have Dockerized that. So I have added this in task file to build the API gateway application also, and then I have added the deployment or Docker Compose configuration. There is no infrastructure component required for this, so I have added this apps.ml. Here I have just added API gateway, and this is going to be the name and API gateway, and a port is 8989. And here is another interesting thing. Here we need to provide, so here if you remember, we have used this environment variables, catalog service URL, order service URL. So when you are running locally directly from your IDE, these values is going to take, but while running all the services in Docker, you need to provide these values different, right? So that's what we are doing in our configuration. So catalog service URL is going to be catalog-service, which is the service name of the Docker service. So similarly like this. And one more configuration change we need to do is, we are talking from order service to catalog service, right? So earlier we have this as catalog. If you take a diff, you can see earlier it was like http catalog-service:8081. But now we are not going to directly talk to any service. Any calls will be go through API gateway. So here we have configured the base URL is going to be API-gateway:8989/catalog. So anything that starts with /catalog is going to be forwarded to catalog service from API gateway. So from order service, we have configured this to API gateway path. Okay. Now I have started all the services, services in Docker. Now let me start all the applications from my IDE. So now I'm starting catalog service and order service, and I'm going to start the API gateway. All services are running directly on my host machine. Okay. So I have started all the three services. Now if I go and try to open the 8989 Swagger UI, now I can see the API endpoint for catalog and orders as well. So now if I go to catalog service and then try to execute one of the API endpoint, right now let us try to fetch all the products. Now if I click on it, here you see this error, failed to fetch, possible reasons, CARS, network failure, usage of schema, HTTP or HTTPS for CARS requests. So we are getting CARS issue. So most of the times when people building REST APIs and trying to integrate with front ends, like building applications using React, Angular or so, most of the people face one time or other this CARS issue. So before fixing this, let us understand what is the CARS issue in the first place. Okay. Let's say you have an application running on some server and assume it's a myapp.com. Okay, so you opened a browser window and you opened myapp.com on this browser window and you are making calls to this same domain myapp.com. So everything works fine because you are on this same origin myapp.com and you are continue making the calls to the same domain which is allowed by default. But if you are currently on this myapp.com on the browser window, but from this application, if you are trying to make API calls to a different domain, let's say here there is another service running otherservice.com. So by default, browser is going to deny that. It is not going to accept making calls to other different domain. So when it is on the same origin, so there is a policy called same origin policy which allows you can make calls to the same domain, but by default it is going to deny making the calls to other services, other domains. So how to make it work? So this is where CARS, cross origin resource sharing, comes into picture. In order to be able to make calls to other domains, so this service otherservice.com, whatever the application we are running on this server, we need to explicitly configure it in such a way that applications from other domains like myapp.com is allowed to make calls to this service from the browser window. So they need to explicitly, the service, not the browser, the service should be configured in such a way that, okay, I am accepting calls from myapp.com browser window. So it is going to serve the request fine. So once it is configured on this server, then you are allowed to make the calls to other domains as well. Okay. And this restriction is for only browser windows, because when a REST API is opened, you are able to directly call it from REST API. REST client like Postman or any other tools. But from the browser window, that too from a other domain application, you are not able to call other domain services. Okay, so this is the problem. So now what is happening here? We started this Swagger UI documentation and right now it is running on localhost 8989. So this is a different domain. But now within this, we are trying to call another domain like localhost 8081. Even if the port is different, it is considered as a different domain. So we are trying to make this call to a different domain. So this is not being allowed. So what we need to do it here. So this is the service, nothing but catalog service. We need to configure catalog service to accept any calls from localhost 8989, or we may even configure it saying that anybody can call our services. So we need to configure catalog service or even order service. We need to configure to accept the calls from other domains. Okay, and this is one thing. Second thing is that is even more interesting. So here, if you take a look at our application, so this is how it is, right? Like catalog service, order service, and these calls are going to be forwarded from API gateway. Now, and assume this is our web application, maybe React application, or even our current application it is going to be. So here we are going to make calls to AJAX calls to API gateway. So we need to enable this CARS to be able to call from this application, but from here we are going to make a call to catalog service or order service, right? But these are not coming from browser. These are coming from the API gateway application. So for this communication between API gateway and catalog service, you don't need to configure catalog service or order service with the CARS enablement, because these calls are not coming from browser window. These calls are coming from API gateway backend application. Okay. So now we are going to configure catalog service and order service to enable this cars, but that is only for being able to call this from the Swagger documentation. But to actually call these services from API gateway, we don't need to add that configuration. Okay, now let's go ahead and add this service from catalog, add this cars configuration to catalog service and order service. In the catalog service under catalog package, I'm going to create a new package called config, and in the config I'm creating this web config which implements this web MVC configurer. So there are so many methods that we can override here. So we are overriding this add cars mappings, and here I am adding this mapping to any API endpoint that starts with API/anything. So for all of these URLs, I am allowing all the methods, and I am allowing all the headers, and I am allowing all origin patterns by specifying this special value star, which means all. So here, if you really want to restrict it, maybe for few methods like HTTP get, HTTP post, only to these two, you can specify that. Similarly, what are all the headers that are only allowed to pass, you can specify if there is any such restriction you want to impose. Similarly, if you are trying to only restrict from certain domains, you can specify, okay, localhost 8989, or if it is fine, you just want to enable calling this API from any other domain, you can specify it as a star, and this represents whether you want to share the cookies or not. So with this configuration, let us go ahead and first run this. With this configuration, restart catalog service and see whether we are able to make this API call from Swagger documentation or not. So here I am going to restart catalog service. And go to Swagger documentation here and try it out. So this time now we are getting the products data. Okay, actual products data. So we are getting this. But as I mentioned, we don't need to configure that if we are trying to establish the communication from API gateway to catalog service. But here what we are doing, from browser window, we are trying to call when we are running an application on localhost 8989, we are trying to make a call directly to a different domain. That's why we need to configure that. So let me, again, to demonstrate, we don't need this for actually running the application. Okay, let me comment this out and restart it. And from here, I'm going to make the call http localhost 8989 / catalog / API / products. So here what I'm doing, I'm making the call to API gateway, but I want to get all the products which are there in the catalog service. We have configured every API that starts with catalog / is going to be forwarded to the catalog service with the rest of the segment. So now we are expecting this to show the products. So it is working fine. So though we did not configure any cars, but here directly from browser window, we are not making the call to catalog service. We are only making the call to API gateway, and behind the scenes API gateway is calling this catalog service. So there is no cars apply because the communication is not from browser window to catalog service. It is from backend service to service. So there is no cars in place. Okay, so we are able to call this one. I hope this cars configuration makes sense to you now. Okay, let's go ahead and in your application, if you need this Swagger documentation to enable this access, then you can configure this. But if you don't want to have Swagger documentation, you don't need to enable this. So similarly, I am going to copy this web MVC config and put it in order service. So right now I'm simply hard coding these values, but maybe you can configure these from the application properties and then specify these values. Okay, so it's up to you. Now let me restart the order service and then see be able to call order service without getting the CARS error or not. So from here I'm going to switch to orders and I'm going to get all the orders. I'm going to try it. So currently there are no orders, so it is giving empty array as a response. So there is no CARS issue right now. And one more interesting thing is right now if you see the server URL, it is showing as localhost 8082. Why? Because we are running all these services. We are running only infra services in Docker, but all the main services, microservices, we are running on direct local host, which are directly accessible here. But if you run all of the services, including the microservices in the Docker environment, then it is going to show it as order-service, catalog-service. So in that case, we will not be able to make the call because our host doesn't know what is catalog-service, right? So let's say, let's go ahead and restart all our services in Docker instead of running them in local. Okay, so I'm going to go here and I'm going to restart. So restart is going to start all the infra services as well as microservices, everything in the Docker environment. Okay, now we stopped everything from our IDE. So let us wait, and once the all the services are running, so right now it is still building. So once all the services are running, we'll try and see what is the problem we are facing. So now all the services are running in Docker only. Now let us go ahead and open our Swagger documentation. But here you can see when you open catalog service, it is not localhost anymore. It is catalog-service 8081. Similarly, if you go to orders, it is going to show it as order-service 8082. But now the problem is if you try to execute, let's say we want to get all the API orders, and here it is going to give the same error because not because CARS issue, but because it is not able to make this API call. There is no host saying order-service. So that is why it is giving this error. But what I did, I have configured cat/etc/host file. Cat. So here in my host file, I added an entry here, localhost 127.0.0.1 catalog-service. So I added this so that when I access catalog-service, it points back to my localhost environment only. So now if I go to catalog service and try to execute this, so I get the data. So if you are trying to access the services when running in Docker, you need to add this into host file to get it working from the from the Swagger UI documentation. Now API gateway is ready, and let us quickly check the Dockerization part. So here in the task file, I have already added this entry to build the API gateway service as well. And in the deployment, there is no infra dependencies, so there is nothing to add. In the apps.yaml file, I have configured the API gateway service, so this is also done. And pipeline for GitHub Actions pipeline, I have already created this API gateway pipeline, so this is also configured. It is very similar to other services, just we need to change this name, and this is also done. So I think we are good with API gateway implementation, and in the next video we are going to build our front-end web application. Okay, so stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.